I'd like to finish up talking about the major orders of birds that we find in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, really just picking up right where I left off in the module. So the first of these would be the order Charadriiformes. And the Charadriiformes include gulls, and there are many different types of gulls. There's a California gull, and also it would include different types of shorebirds. Again, tremendous variety here, but an example would be the avocet. And so with both gulls and the shorebirds, they're semi-migratory. Some of them do migrate in from long distances, mostly migrate in and out from relatively short distances. Some will spend the winter in the area. So again, quite a bit of diversity in this group, and a tremendously diverse group. Another order are the Galliformes, which is the order that includes chickens. And probably the two most outstanding members of this group, at least that you'd see in the ecosystem pretty regularly, one would be the sage grouse. And the sage grouse we tend to find down in the Grand Teton National Park in the Jackson Hole area. And sage grouse and the blue grouse, also what I'll get to in a second, is a really dramatic bird in the autumn. So when they're mating and doing their mating displays, the males have these large thoracic pouches that they use, and they'll fill with air, and they produce a really amazing sound. I won't attempt to duplicate it, but you might Google sage grouse and see if you can find a link to the call of the sage grouse that you hear in the fall. But this is an animal that is at least on the threatened list in the area. There's only about 200 of these birds in the ecosystem, but surprisingly we see them quite a bit when we go up there with our field class. And we encounter them in the canyons, but in the winter and fall they'll move down into the valleys, and that's typically where you see them there. And then the blue grouse is another grouse that we find at higher altitudes. So this is more typical up in Yellowstone National Park. This picture was taken at probably about 9,500 feet, close to 10,000 feet on Mount Washburn. And I've seen a lot of the blue grouse on Mount Washburn. So anyway, so the blue grouse prefers slightly higher elevations, usually about 1,000 feet higher than the sage grouse, at least in my experience. Another order would be the Syconiformes. Most common member that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem would be the great blue heron. Herons like to perch in dead trees typically when they're not feeding, and they're very cryptic. They'll blend right in. Sometimes we're right up on them on a raft or a canoe before we even notice them. They don't like to be around people very much. So they're easily spooked, and we try not to spook wildlife when we have our field class in the area. And anyway, but they feed on fish. They'll feed on amphibians. They'll feed on snakes, pretty much anything they can catch, but usually find them along waterways, although occasionally out in some fields looking for small animals there. The Caprimugiformes is one that you may not see that much unless you look closely. It includes the common poorwill and also the nighthawk. And you'll see poorwills and nighthawks flying with swallows typically. Their wing shape and other characteristics are a little different, so they're actually put into their own order. But this is an example of a nighthawk, and as you can see, they really blend into rocks and gravel. And we consider this kind of coloration, this blending coloration, as cryptic coloration. And so they don't really build nests. They literally will lay their eggs right on rock like this and incubate them there, and then the young will hatch out there, and the young also are kind of stippled like this and blend in very well. And we have actually come upon nighthawks like this and a poorwill before, just sitting on the ground, nesting an egg, and practically invisible. Just amazing how well they blend in. And in flight, the nighthawks are usually fairly easy to pick out compared to the swallows, because they do have these white markings on the wings, and that's very distinctive. And the nighthawks really have excellent night vision. And will be out later than most of the swallows. So the swallows will come out in the evening, so you also see them in the dawn, but the nighthawks will stay later into the evening, almost into dark, and actually sometimes into dark, and sometimes you'll see them before dawn as well, but those white markings really distinguish them. And again, they're going to be feeding on insects flying. The Apodiformes, or the hummingbirds, there's a fair number of hummingbirds in the area, not tremendous diversity, but I believe this is the broad-tailed hummingbird. But quite a few different hummingbirds. Hummingbirds, for the most part, migrate very long distances. Some hummingbirds are migrating all the way from Central America to northern United States and even into Canada. And hummingbirds will be feeding on all of those incredible wildflowers that we were talking about earlier, feeding on the nectar and pollen in those, and can be incredibly aggressive. You know, they're territorial. It's very interesting to see some of the battles that hummingbirds have over territories. You know, again, cute little animal that can be extraordinarily aggressive. And I've seen actually hummingbirds with broken bills from some of the fights that they've gotten in over territory. And a lot of times you can find hummingbird nests by observing hummingbird behavior. You can see them zipping in and out of trees. And again, there's really nothing cuter in the world than to see baby hummingbirds in the nest. And a lot of times they'll build them low in the tree, not necessarily up high, but I've seen hummingbird nests, you know, at eye level. So again, you don't want to disturb the nest if possible, but it is an amazing thing to see. And then the piciformes, which are the woodpeckers. And so woodpeckers have some amazing adaptations. One is that the brain is encased in a very thick layer of fluid to protect it. They also have a very long tongue that has a spike-like structure on the end. It's hard, kind of keratinized the tip of the tongue so that they can drill into the wood and then pull out grubs, larvae that they find in the wood. So, so there have been a lot of woodpeckers in the ecosystem because there's been a lot of dying trees, there's been fires and so on, and so this brings in termites, this brings in beetles, and also just the beetle damage in general is something that attracts the woodpeckers. So some examples of woodpeckers are the flicker. So there are a couple of species of flicker up there, and again, they just are going to town on bark all over the ecosystem. And the downy woodpecker is, I believe, the smallest woodpecker in the ecosystem. It is quite small. You can see it has the red coloration on the head. A close relative is the hairy woodpecker, which looks almost identical to the downy woodpecker. It just happens to be a little bit bigger. Another woodpecker that we find up there is the yellow-naped woodpecker, which again kind of looks like the others. This one isn't really showing us the yellow coloration that they typically have, but there's yellowish coloration in most of these. But again, a fair diversity of woodpeckers and quite a few woodpeckers in the ecosystem. So this certainly isn't all of the birds that we're going to find up there, but it gives you an idea of the diversity and some of the major types of birds that you're likely to encounter as you travel in the Yellowstone ecosystem.